I would like to just open with a little introduction. We will now be hearing from Dr. Hanna Notte, who is going to be speaking to us today about Russia and Middle East conflicts, the case of Syria, and broader lessons. Hanna is a senior political officer with the Shaikh Group, which is a non-profit consultancy focused on Track 2 diplomacy and conflict mediation in the Middle East. She supports the organization's engagement with Russia related to the Syria Track 2 Dialogue Initiative and also works on other Track 2 dialogues related to the broader region. Hanna holds a DPhil in International Relations from the University of Oxford, St. Antony's College, which we were just talking about, from where she also received an MPhil in 2014. She spent a year between 2015 and 2016 in Moscow on an Alpha Fellowship with the Institute of Oriental Studies and the Carnegie Moscow Center. Other visiting research positions have included the IISS's Middle East office in Manama, Bahrain, and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation's Syria-Iraq office in Beirut, Lebanon. Hanna holds a BA in Social and Political Sciences from the University of Cambridge and worked at Goldman Sachs London offices as a strategic equity analyst from 2010 to 2012. Her research interests focus on Russian foreign policy in the Middle East, WMD arms control and non-proliferation in the Middle East, and US-Russian relations. She has lectured on Russian foreign policy in the Middle East, including at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, the American University of Paris, and the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, and is regularly invited to speak at international events and conferences on the subject. Hanna is a non-resident scholar with the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. She is a German national who speaks Russian, Arabic, and French. And last but not least, of course, Hanna is an alumna of the Monterey Summer Symposium on Russia. So please give a warm MSSR 2020 welcome to Hanna Notte.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Just checking, okay. It's really good to meet everyone. I really wish we could have met in person in Monterey, which for those of you who haven't been is a lovely place. And I'm lucky, as you just mentioned, I've been involved with this program for the last 4 years. I was a participating student when it first started in 2017. And then I've been teaching this course on the Middle East, Russia and the Middle East for the last 3 summers. And so I'm feeling very sad for all of you guys who, due to current circumstances, weren't able to travel to California, but I hope you'll get to go in the future to Monterey because it's a great place to be and to study. What we're going to do today and tomorrow is take a dive into Russia's foreign policy in the Middle East, which I guess is a file that has become important to look at in recent years, given Russia's involvement in Syria, but also what's going on in Libya, Iran, a lot of conflicts and tensions that we see in international headlines these days are to do with the Middle East, and Russia plays a prominent role in them. So today we'll start with Syria. Syria is an important case study to look at. The conflict is now in its 10th year, and I've been sort of looking at it academically for many years, but then also been involved in Track 2 diplomacy on the conflict for the last 3 years. And it's a very suitable case study if you want to understand Russia's interests and Russia's involvement in the Middle East. Now that is because, first of all, Syria is a prime example of a so-called Arab Spring case. So it lends itself very well to understanding why Russia and Western countries took different positions as to how you produce positive change or stability in the region. It's also an interesting case study, an important case study, given the sheer relevance of Syria to Moscow. So important that Moscow decided in September 2015 to militarily intervene in a conflict in the region. It's also a good case study because of its sheer longevity. I mean, it's in its 10th year. So the Syria conflict stretches over 2 US administrations, the Obama and the Trump administration. So it also allows us to look at continuity versus change in US policy towards Syria, and to ask to what extent that has mattered, or in fact hasn't mattered, for Russia's position. And finally, it's a good case study because the conflict, and I hope to show this to you today, even though we don't have that much time, the conflict became very complex and fragmented over time, and different actors from the region started to play important roles. So the way Russia plays its cards on Syria also has an impact on its relations with Turkey, with Iran, with Israel, with the Gulf players. So it's also an interesting case study in that regard. So what we'll do today is we'll sort of have a quick overview of the Syrian crisis, its political and its military trajectory over time, spend some time explaining why Russia has, over the last decade really, supported the Syrian government, why it's stuck with the Syrian government, and try to identify what have been the main reasons why Russia and Western countries simply couldn't get themselves to cooperate in ending this conflict. What have been the reasons for that? And hopefully, if we understand sort of the track one negotiations, the Geneva process, and why it has failed to solve the Syrian conflict until today, if we understand that, that will also be a good background for all of you guys for Friday, where we'll have this longer track two panel with various other participants. But I'll be speaking on Friday on track two diplomacy on Syria and what it can and cannot do. And of course, you know, understanding the track one will be an important backdrop for that. So let's go right into it and kind of look at how it all started. So when the Syrian uprising began in the spring of 2011, initially with peaceful protests in the south of the country, which then eventually spread to the north and to the rest of the country, and the Assad government was completely defiant in the face of these protests, Russia very quickly took a pretty principled position. It wanted to constrain involvement of the Security Council from the outset, together with China. It claimed, the Russian government claimed in the summer of 2011 that there would be considerable consequences for the Middle East if outside forces meddle in what are internal affairs of the Syrian state. And rather than imposing sanctions or getting the Security Council involved, what external players should do is work very patiently with all sides to the conflict in order to find a solution. As I said, Russia was also backed by China in that regard. So 1 year into the conflict, the Arab League and the UN appoint Kofi Annan as a special envoy for Syria. And he got to work towards a ceasefire in 2012, but that quickly failed. And in the summer of 2012, he convenes the Geneva I conference on Syria. This is an important thing to keep in mind. This is essentially the birth of the track one process for Syria, the Geneva conference. And that conference sets out what's called the Geneva Communique. That's still an important reference document on Syria until the present day. And that Geneva Communique, it was supported by Russia. It called for the formation of a power-sharing government in Syria that would include the regime and the opposition. But now importantly, that communique did not spell out whether the departure of the Assad government would be a precondition for this power-sharing government or not. So kind of the elephant in the room was not solved. So why is it that Russia and the West sort of took different positions on supporting or being against the Assad government? I think, first of all, Russia has had a concern with preserving what I call state order, or stable, centralized regimes in the Middle East, and also related to the Syrian conflict, because from the very beginning, Russian diplomats, the Russian government did not see any credible plan for how you would preserve existing Syrian state institutions if you simply force Assad to leave. And when you talk to Russian diplomats about the Arab Spring protests more broadly, the account that you will hear goes approximately along the following lines. They will say that, yes, there were legitimate grievances, there were protests in the region, including in Syria, but that the people would not have demanded this rapid, disruptive, Western type change, but that basically outside forces, mainly meaning Western capitals, then engaged in a process of what Russians would call social political engineering. So an intrusion into the social fabric of these countries, fostering and fomenting this protest to kind of escalate. Russian diplomats will say to you that after the Second World War, what you had in the Middle East is nationalist dictatorships like in Egypt, like in Iraq, like in Syria, which actually, where you had very diverse societies, Syria, for instance, ethnically and religiously quite diverse. And these regimes, though, managed to keep these states together, balancing between Islam and tribal relations, which was a very delicate challenge. And so when outside intrusion happened during the Arab Spring, that fragile balance was broken and these states were destroyed. Libya is something that Russia would immediately point to, and which was an important precedent in their mind as their policy towards Syria was formulating. And these states were destroyed and have struggled to rebuild anything resembling stability ever since. They would say, look at Iraq today, look at Libya today, even look at Egypt today. None of these states are truly stable. And I think there's sort of one phrase that stuck in my mind by a Russian diplomat that really epitomizes this idea. He said to me, statehood in the Middle East is like a Mercedes engine. It's very easy to take apart, but very hard to put back together. And that has been the Russian concern in the region. Now, I think the Libyan experience, I already briefly mentioned it, was very formative in that sense. Just a quick background on Libya. It was in March 2011 that the Security Council endorsed Resolution 1973, which authorized a no-fly zone over Libya. So an unprecedented mandate was given under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter to use military force for explicitly humanitarian purposes. At the time, you will recall that President Medvedev abstained from the Security Council vote for reasons that go beyond Libya. And Russian diplomats were then really kind of shocked as to how the mandate of that resolution unfolded, and ultimately, a few months later, led to the ouster of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. And so, this is happening roughly around the same time. So to Russians, that Libya experience was very fresh on their minds. Then there's, of course, Russia's own historical experience, where in the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, you had Russia's majority Muslim indigenous population in the North Caucasus, especially in Chechnya, unrest, and a real worry that Chechen separatism could spill over into other parts of the Russian Federation, even lead to the breakup of the Russian Federation. And so I think to Putin, who comes to power and prominence in the context of the Second Chechen War in the late 1990s, this idea that it's this promise of Western-style democracy that is brought, that also entails a devolution of power from a strong center, that ultimately also fueled chaos and unrest in the North Caucasus, should not be underestimated, in the sense that that has also informed the way he has looked at Syria 2 decades or a decade later. And then finally, this is also, of course, related to Russia's view on color revolutions more broadly, the worry that protests lead to unrest that will also spill over into other societies. Now, of course, that generated much earlier than the Arab Spring in Russia's own neighborhood in the post-Soviet space. But it is a theme, I think, that came back, and that you also see in the Russian official discourse very much again when the Arab Spring starts. That there's a worry that, certain models are being practiced in the Middle East that could also later be implemented elsewhere. And of course, here Russia means the post-Soviet space, or even Russia itself. So much for kind of the backdrop to Russia's position in support of the Syrian government. There were other reasons that have to do maybe more with Russia's economic interests in Syria, with wanting to preserve a base from which to project power into the region. I will go more into that tomorrow when I talk about Russia's broader interest in the Middle East. Now, of course, as a result of these differing positions that Russia and the West took on the Assad government, vis-a-vis the Assad government, they also had very different positions on the armed opposition, which was slowly crystallizing in Syria, and which in itself is a very complex phenomenon because the opposition in Syria, the armed opposition, fragmented over time, with parts of it becoming increasingly radicalized. You eventually have the emergence of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda offshoots in Syria, which makes the landscape even more complicated and also causes the Americans to get involved in counterterrorism in Syria. So I just want to spend 5 minutes on the armed opposition because it's important also to understand Russia's policy in the conflict. Now, of course, all states in principle condemn terrorism, but as we know, concrete designations of who's a terrorist and who isn't, and what a legitimate means to fight terrorism has been contested in the international community. And the Syrian war has probably epitomized that contestation over the last decade pretty well. So I just want to say that at a very fundamental level, Russia has rejected, in the Syrian context, a distinction between good and bad armed opponents to the Assad government. It has adopted more of a binary struggle. Those who take up arms against the Assad regime are terrorists. That binary discourse had later as an additional overlay because Russia also argued that it is engaged in a civilizational struggle. Once ISIS became prominent in Syria, Russia argued it is not only fighting the terrorists who seek to overthrow the Assad government, but indeed Russia is taking on a civilizational challenge in Syria that poses a threat to international peace and security. Now, broadly speaking, the US and European countries, they've differentiated between groups like the Islamic State or incarnations of Al-Qaeda on the one hand, and then other armed groups that they saw worthy of supporting. And so the US initially supported who they called moderate rebels early on in the conflict with non-lethal aid. Then there was a train and equip program, which the US though abandoned in October 2015. But importantly, and this is important to understand for where we are also today, when the Americans started combating the Islamic State with Operation Inherent Resolve from late 2014 in Iraq, but also in northeast Syria, they partnered with mainly Kurdish forces on the ground in that counterterrorism struggle. The so-called YPG, which became the backbone of what's called the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF. The Americans partnered with those forces on the ground. Now, another thing I do want to say, because it also shows you, it gives you an insight into the pragmatism in Russian foreign policy in the Middle East. As a matter of public discourse, Russia had this binary distinction between terrorists and non-terrorists. As a matter of practical policy, those more gray groups, Russia took very different positions over time in terms of what was politically expedient. So Ahrar al-Sham and Jaish al-Islam are two such groups, which Russia has at times tried to list as terrorist groups through the UN Security Council. But then at various points in the conflict, Russian diplomats did include these groups into ceasefire talks, invited them to other peace talks and conferences, and basically dealt with them when it was politically expedient. And I think that's an important element to understand as well. So maybe to quickly summarize, the key drivers for Russia's support, which I think really remain consistent until the present day, have been a concern with state order or status quo in the Middle East, especially to avoid another Libya scenario at the time, an aversion to disorderly change or change that Russia cannot control, and finally a fear of implications of regime change for developments beyond the Middle East, including in the post-Soviet space, so the so-called domino effect. Now let's move to what happens after 2015, which is the moment Russia decides to intervene in the Syrian conflict. Now that decision in September 2015 was, as I said, unprecedented. The key driver at the time was Russia's worry that the regime might indeed fall. I'm showing you a map here of that time. The Syrian government back then controlled around 22% of Syrian territory. So those areas in sort of light red towards the west of the country, the coastal areas. And there were really three objectives at the time. I was actually in Moscow back then at the Oriental Institute and the Carnegie Center, and I mean, people were shocked that this was happening. And as you can imagine, there was much debate among Russian experts and analysts what this means and where this is going. So part of this analysis is also coming from these conversations at the time. Definitely the main objective was to prevent the regime from collapsing and all the consequences that could have entailed. But another objective was to break out of for Russia to break out of political isolation at the time and force Washington, by creating new facts on the ground in Syria, to deal with Russia as an equal. There was a sense, I think, in the fall of 2015 that US-Russian, Western-Russian relations had unraveled too far after Crimea and the Ukraine crisis, and there was a desire to put those relations back on track. And why not do that through Syria? So there was a hope for cooperation at the time. Now, those hopes did not come to fruition. I think there was a sense in Washington in the fall of 2015 that the Russians are possibly up for a quagmire in Syria. Initial signs, were not too great for Russia. A Russian passenger plane was shot down over the Sinai in October 2015. Saudi clerics issued a fatwa calling for jihad against Russia. I mean, there was a lot of backlash among the backers of the Syrian opposition. So the cooperation that Russia hoped for, at the time it was even invoking the analogy of the Second World War, when the Soviet Union and the United States jointly fought Nazism. In Germany, Russia and the US also forged a joint counterterrorism front in Syria. Those hopes did not come to fruition, which brings us to the next phase, starting from 2016, which now I think brings us into the most interesting phase of the Syrian war, which is when Russia starts to look for other partners. Now, in order to understand what happens from 2016, we need to look at three developments. Let's start with the military developments on the ground. So I don't want to go into details in terms of the aircraft and air power that Russia brought to bear in the initial phase of the Syrian conflict. I just want to say that that by early 2016, so a few months into the operation, the intervention is showing real results. The morale of the Syrian army is boosted. I mean, this is also at the time, of course, coalition warfare. You have Iranian forces and Iran-backed militias also on the ground, backed by Russian air power. The Russian Navy is massively involved with logistical supplies in what's called the Syrian Express. So this is proving successful. Now, meanwhile, what's happening diplomatically is that for various reasons from 2016, those countries who backed the armed opposition or the opposition more broadly are slowly starting to get disengaged. I think Turkey is probably the most important to start with. So you'll remember that in November 2015, this is 2 months into Russia's Syria intervention, there's a major crisis in Russian-Turkish relations after the Turks shot down a Russian fighter jet. Putin is furious. The Russians introduced sanctions against the Turkish economy. Russian tourists stopped going to Turkey. There's a real crisis. And then Erdogan sort of apologizes with this letter in the summer of 2016, and the two kind of make up. And then I think you have a very consequential development. Turkey was one of the main opponents of the Assad government and backer of the Syrian opposition. But because the Americans are partnering with the Kurdish forces in northeast Syria, Turkey's national security priorities start to change. It is no longer about seeing Assad leave. The number one priority now becomes preventing a Kurdish statelet on the Turkish-Syrian border. So what Turkey does is in August 2016, it intervenes across the border in what's called Operation Euphrates Shield into northeast Syria. And the Russians essentially give a sort of yellow light to that operation. They don't stand in the way. Putin, I think, understands that Turkish priorities have changed, and the Russians let it happen. In return, Turkey sort of acquiesces to the fall of Aleppo in December 2016, a major opposition stronghold, big city in the north of Syria, which, the fall of Aleppo in December 2016 is a real, really kills the morale of the Syrian opposition in a major way. So you have a real alignment between Russia and Turkey crystallizing at that time, which is very consequential for the course of the war from there. At the same time, you have the Gulf states also relatively more disengaged from Syria and backing the Syrian opposition, because I think Mohammed bin Salman at the time decides that you can't confront the Iranians in Yemen and in Syria to an equal extent. And so they're more focused on the Yemen war. Meanwhile, what's going on in the US? Now in 2016, the US is in full pre-election mode. Trump administration comes into office in early 2017, and Trump makes it clear pretty quickly that he's not all that interested in Syria or the Middle East for that matter at all, that there may be two US objectives in Syria: the sustainable defeat of the Islamic State and to contain Iranian influence. But there's not a whole lot of engagement diplomatically or otherwise. And that changes a bit later when James Jeffrey, the special envoy for Syria, comes in 2018. But 2016, 2017, you don't see much US pressure or diplomacy. So I'd say that military gains on the ground for the regime, enabled by Russia and Iran, Russia's rapprochement with Turkey, relative disengagement by the Gulf states and the US, all this together also opens up new possibilities for Russia and Syria, possibilities for Russian diplomacy. So what happens is that Russia launches the so-called Astana process in early 2017 after the fall of Aleppo, where it cooperates with Iran and Turkey. You see the presidents here in the upper left corner, and actually the other picture in the bottom right, I took literally this afternoon, or I didn't take it, I found it this afternoon, because there was just another Astana Troika presidential summit this very afternoon, virtual due to COVID-19. Now this Astana format is supposed to be a sort of a parallel track to the Geneva process, and it's supposed to tackle really more military related questions like de-escalation, ceasefires, the exchange of detainees. But slowly, the Astana process also starts to tackle political questions. What this Astana format does in 2017 is formalize these so-called de-escalation zones in Syria. I wanted to spend a minute explaining that. You can see those on this map, 4 de-escalation zones in Daraa in the southwest of the country towards the Israeli border, Eastern Ghouta, which is right next to the capital Damascus, in northern Homs and in Idlib. And basically with Russian involvement, I mean, in the context of the Astana format, but also with involvement of some other players like the US, Jordan, Egypt, de-escalation zones in these 4 areas are being negotiated in the first half of 2017. And I'll show you an excerpt from the memorandum that creates these de-escalation zones. The idea is that you have a ceasefire as an explicitly temporary measure, pause in fighting, but that ultimately the fight against those who are considered terrorist groups, especially the Islamic State and Nusra affiliated groups, would continue. Now, what basically happens as a result of these de-escalation zones is that there's a pause, a relative calm and pause in the west of the country, which allows the Syrian government to turn eastwards and to retake more and more territory towards the east. Now, there's only so far that the government can go. I'll show you quickly another map, this map. It can only really go towards the Euphrates River, because east of that you have the Americans and the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, the Syrian government, even backed by Russia, was not going to pick a military fight with the Americans. So it went all the way east as far as it could. And then when it was done with that, it returned towards the de-escalation zones. And now this binary discourse is kicking back in. Because while you had the de-escalation zone, the Russians were basically saying, okay, now there's a pause in fighting, so all the moderate groups can please dissociate themselves from the terrorists. And then Russia complains that that hasn't really happened, but moderate rebels have continued to remain embedded with terrorist groups. Nusra offshoots are still around. So the terrorist discourse is then justified in early 2018 to go back into these zones and retake them militarily. Now, what effectively happens is, and it's kind of unfolds along the same pattern each time, the regime advances militarily. Russia steps in as a mediator and as a negotiator with the local rebels to negotiate these so-called local reconciliation deals. What that effectively means is the rebels are offered to settle their status with the Syrian state, which means to give up their heavy weapons, in some instances also to accept to be conscripted into the Syrian army. And if you don't want that, you're ready to leave. Those who are not reconcilable can leave. And in all instances, and this is happening in 2018, the hardcore rebels go to Idlib. So Idlib in the northwest of the country, which is still not under regime control as of today, becomes a sort of dumping ground for rebels who don't want to reconcile with the Syrian state. And Russia deploys also military police in big numbers, mostly from the North Caucasus, into these reconciled areas in order to keep the calm. So meanwhile, what's happening on the actual diplomatic track? I told you that in 2012, the Geneva process was born, and that still exists. And there's some positive momentum after the Russian intervention in late 2015. And resolution 2254 is being endorsed by the Security Council. That remains the reference resolution for the Syrian peace process till today. But without wanting to go into too much detail, the political opposition faces the same problem of fragmentation as does the military opposition. You have different platforms emerging who are associated with different backers. One is called the Cairo platform, one's called the Riyadh platform. You have the Moscow platform of opposition that is closer to the Russians, and a real struggle in forming one coherent opposition that can negotiate with the Syrian government. You have various rounds of Geneva talks in 2016, 2017 that really don't produce anything, because remember, while this is happening on the diplomatic track, the Syrian government is taking more and more territory. So if it wasn't going to negotiate with an opposition in 2012, it's not going to negotiate in 2016 or 2017. So you have this constant binary regime opposition dynamic, which you can't break through, and Russia backing the Syrian government in the Security Council, which is not to say that Russia hasn't tried over time to get the government to also make certain concessions and negotiate on certain issues with the opposition. What Russia does then, interestingly, sorry, I need to go to the next slide. We have Geneva, we have the Astana process, and now Russia opens a third diplomatic front with the Sochi Congress in January 2018, which is a sort of format that's supposed to move Syria towards a national reconciliation process. The rhetoric already at that time in early 2018 is the Syrian war is over, the war is coming to an end, and Russia has a great desire in 2018 to renormalize Syria's relations with the outside world. And so in order to advance that process, it also wants to launch a national reconciliation process. Now, the result of the Sochi Congress was the proclamation of a constitutional committee for Syria that was supposed to be composed of 1/3 regime or Syrian government delegates, 1/3 opposition, and 1/3 civil society members. The regime, of course, was kind of lukewarm about this from the beginning. They said, if anything, we'll negotiate amendments to the current Syrian constitution. We're not going to negotiate a new constitution. And there's repeated stalling, all just to say that this thing is announced in January 2018, and the Constitutional Committee is launched last fall in October 2019. So it took another 1.5 years to even get there. And by the way, all we're now talking about is constitutional reform. The other elements of the Geneva process, like elections, like transitional government, are sort of off the table. So as you can imagine, the implementation of this Constitutional Committee and who would be in it, which was kind of worked out over this 18-month period, was also completely driven by the Astana Troika states, especially Russia and Turkey. This is not to say that Western countries were completely disengaged. You have a so-called small group of countries, including the United States, France, Britain, Germany, and then also Saudi, Jordan, and Egypt, who are kind of trying to pose a counterweight to the Astana Troika, but their leverage over this file is less significant. So where are we today? I want to spend maybe just 5-10 minutes at the end, taking a balance sheet and then taking a step back and distinguishing between different factors that have made it so hard for Russia and Western countries to cooperate on Syria. Where are we today? So militarily, this is a map of early 2020, but not all that much has changed. Militarily, the regime controls about 70% of Syrian territory versus 22% in the summer of 2015. Some countries in the region have already begun a process of normalization with the Syrian government. Russia's focus for the last 18 months, 24 months, has been on what's called the 3 Rs: reconstructing Syria, refugee return, and rehabilitation of the Syrian government. That is what Russia's diplomatic focus has been on. Meanwhile, the main track one, the Geneva process, has become marginalized. The political process has de facto been reduced to a conversation about constitutional reform. And what about the Americans and the Europeans? Well, they have engaged over the last 2 years in a maximum economic pressure campaign against the Syrian government, saying there will be no reconstruction money, let alone normalization with the Assad government, in the absence of what they call a credible political process. So the Americans are no longer talking about regime change in Syria. The narrative is now about a behavior change of the Syrian regime. And you will have heard that some 10 days ago, the Caesar Act came into effect, imposing new sanctions, not just on Syrian individuals, but also third-party enablers, including possibly Russian, Iranian, Hezbollah designees, who economically enable the Syrian government's ability to continue to wage war. 2 important pockets remain outside the control of the Syrian government. First of all, you have the northwest of the country. That's the Euphrates Shield areas. I'll go back to this map. The Euphrates Shield areas taken by Turkey in 2016 remain under Turkish control, increasingly under economic and governance control of Turkey. And then also in the northwest, you have Idlib, where you might recall from the news earlier this year, you had a massive confrontation between Turkey and Russia and the Syrian government, and things really heating up and escalating in Idlib. Putin and Erdogan then signed a ceasefire on March 5th, and possibly also due to COVID-19, things have been relatively quiet since then. I mean, more recently, Russian airstrikes have resumed again, but not in a massive fashion. The ultimate status of Idlib province is somewhat unclear. The Syrian government certainly says it'll retake every inch of Syrian territory eventually. To my mind, Russia doesn't have a huge appetite right now, at least in the short term, to enable another Syrian regime offensive on Idlib, also because that's a delicate file with the Turks, and Russian-Turkish relations are complicated. So that is one important chunk of territory that's not controlled by the Syrian government. And then you have northeast Syria, where I already mentioned the Syrian Democratic Forces, where the Kurdish YPG is the major backbone, have been supported by the Americans and control that part of territory. Now, that's also an interesting kind of and complicated part of Syria, because the Trump administration, I mean, Trump personally was somewhat ambivalent as to why the Americans are there and what they're needed for. And after his famous tweet in December 2018, when he sort of said, well, we've defeated ISIS, now let Erdogan take care of it. Actors on the ground have been really hedging and worrying that the Americans might leave. I mean, our interlocutors in our own Track 2 work have over the last year and a half been worried, how long will the Americans stay? Because if the Americans leave, that has major implications for actors in the region. Turkey intervened across the border into this blue strip that you see in October 2019 in what became Operation Peace Spring. So you have a very complex situation in northeast Syria as well. Russia, again, positioning itself as a mediator, trying to get the Kurds to speak with the regime, to work something out. Again, it's somewhat unclear how sustainable that situation is, and much will depend on US policy going forward. But then I just want to say, not all is well in regime-held Syria either. In the southwest of the country, in Daraa, you have renewed protests in recent weeks. You have an Israeli issue in Syria, which I haven't even begun to mention, but we'll go into it tomorrow, which is continuous Israeli strikes on Iranian or Iranian-backed militia positions, weapons convoys in Syria, because that to Israel is a major security threat. And you have the economic situation, which is bad. I mean, it was bad for a long time, but it's gone from bad to worse in anticipation of the Caesar Act coming into effect. The Syrian currency took a major hit in recent weeks. The Caesar Act, which I'm showing here, is going to squeeze the Syrian economy even further. And so I'll just sort of end this picture by saying that, to my mind, the fragmentation of Syria into these different zones is going to be durable over the medium term. I see limited prospects for Russia-West cooperation on any of these issues. You know, there are smaller issues like the question of UN cross-border aid into Syria, which is again at the Security Council this week. Will they find a compromise on that? Will they work on the Constitutional Committee together? You know, but it's not, that's not cooperation and really solving this conflict. And I think, I mean, the predominant debate today in Western capitals is the following question: will the economic maximum pressure campaign against the Syrian government, and by extension Russia, force a recalculation in Moscow and change Russian policy on Syria? That is sort of the hope. To what extent that is realistic hope or not, we can debate. Or can Russia sort of live with a frozen conflict where economically things are bad for quite some time in Syria, you know, and doesn't really need it to get better? I'll stop by just sort of summarizing what I see as the major obstacles to Russian-Western cooperation in Syria over time. There are factors that have to do with simply the different perspectives and views and how you produce positive change, stability in this region or in individual societies in that region. That is what I started this lecture with. In terms of the prescription, in terms of what Syria needs today, there's a stark divergence between Russia's view and those in Western capitals. For Russia, as I said, it is the 3 Rs: renormalize relations with Syria, reconstruct it, help it get back on its feet, and support refugee return. But the Western argument is that that is just a cosmetic attitude that Russia has, you know, that the underlying social contract in Syria has been broken, and that Russia, by just preserving the current order in Syria, the existing order, basically perpetuates the basic issues in Syria that led to the uprising in the first place in 2011. So there, the perspectives simply diverge. Then cooperation has also been hampered by regional dynamics and the fact that, you know, players that became very involved and invested in the Syrian conflict, like Turkey, like Iran, like Israel, are very independently minded players who are not just American or Russian puppets. So this notion that you maybe had during the Cold War, which is that only if the Americans and the Russians sit together and decide on, you know, on how to solve this conflict, everything will fall into place, is really not viable, because especially Turkey and Israel, they've taken decisions in this conflict very much, you know, advancing their own perceptions of their security requirements, circumventing Russian and American positions. And then finally, I guess, and this is maybe somewhat of a more obvious point, the broader context in Russian-American relations also hasn't helped. Everything I've been saying has unfolded against the backdrop of increasingly poisonous relations. And if in 2015, there was still a hope, certainly on the Russian side, that cooperation on a narrow file like Syria could positively spill over into the broader relationship, I don't think that that hope still exists today. I mean, I'd be curious to hear the perspective of others, but Syria as a file in itself is no longer sufficient to produce cooperation on other issues. That time has passed. And Russia has embedded itself in Syria. It has used Syria as a platform to project power, as a mediator, as a military power. And so this has also become a matter of status to Russia. I'll stop there, and I'll be very happy to take questions, comments, and engage in a discussion.